Picture ancient Athens, if you will. A bustling hub of democracy, art, and grand ideas. Marble temples gleam under the Mediterranean sun. Philosophers in togas debate the very nature of existence in the busy marketplace, the agora. And wandering through this vibrant scene is a man who looks by all accounts rather like a satyr. He has a snub nose, bulging eyes, and a bit of a paunch. He owns no property, writes no books, and charges no fees for his wisdom. This curious figure is Socrates. He wasn't your typical teacher standing at a lectern and dictating facts. Instead, he was what you might call a professional question asker. Quite an irritating profession to have, you might imagine, and you wouldn't be wrong. Socrates believed that the first step to wisdom was admitting you knew nothing at all. A rather humbling start, isn't it? He would amble up to the most important and supposedly cleverest people in Athens, the politicians, the poets, the generals, and begin a conversation. He'd start simply asking them to define a concept they claimed to be an expert in. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? With a series of deceptively simple questions, he would gently, or perhaps not so gently, lead them down a path where their confident answers would unravel, revealing that they, in fact, didn't really know what they were talking about. This method, now famously known as the Socratic method, was brilliant for uncovering truth, but absolutely dreadful for making friends in high places. His mission, as he saw it, was a divine one. He famously described himself as a gadfly, a pesky insect sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of the Athenian state into action. The horse, in this analogy, had grown sluggish and complacent, too comfortable in its own supposed greatness. Socrates was there to buzz around its ears, to bite and annoy it, to keep it awake and thinking. He wanted people to examine their lives, their beliefs, and their values. He famously declared that the unexamined life is not worth living. For him, true knowledge wasn't about having all the answers, but about the continuous, relentless pursuit of them through critical thought and self-reflection. This constant questioning made him a hero to some, especially the young men of Athens who flocked to listen to his public interrogations. They were fascinated by this intellectual giant who could dismantle the arguments of their elders with pure logic. They saw him as a breath of fresh air, a man who challenged authority and encouraged them to think for themselves. But to others, particularly those in power whose ignorance he had so publicly exposed, he was a menace. He was a disruptive force, a public nuisance who undermined tradition and authority. And as Athens faced political turmoil after a long and costly war, the city's patience for its resident gadfly was beginning to wear dangerously thin. So, how does a city turn on its most famous thinker? It happens when fear and politics get tangled up with philosophy. In 399 BC, 3 Athenian citizens, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, brought formal charges against the 70-year-old Socrates. The indictment was twofold and sounded terribly serious. First, he was accused of, or impiety. This meant he was charged with not believing in the gods of the state, and even worse, introducing new, strange divinities of his own. This was a grave accusation in a society where religious rituals were deeply woven into the fabric of civic life. To question the gods was to question the very foundation of Athens itself. The second charge was perhaps even more damaging in the eyes of the public, corrupting the youth. This was a direct consequence of his popularity with the young men of the city. His accusers claimed that by teaching them to question everything, including their parents and the state's leaders, he was leading them astray. He was turning them into insolent, disrespectful citizens who would tear down the established order. Think of it from the perspective of a powerful Athenian father. You see your son, once obedient, now following this shabby old man around, laughing as he makes a fool of respected officials and then coming home to question your own authority. You can see how that might get under your skin. Behind these official charges lay a deep well of political resentment. Many of the men Socrates had publicly embarrassed were powerful figures. Anytus, one of his main accusers, was an influential politician. Furthermore, some of Socrates' former associates, like Alcibiades and Critias, had turned out to be notorious traitors who had harmed Athens during its recent political upheavals. It was all too easy for his enemies to draw a line, however unfairly, from Socrates' teachings to the treacherous actions of these men. The trial was, in many ways, a political move disguised as a religious and moral one, a way to silence a critic and find a scapegoat for the city's recent troubles. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. Socrates, the man who had spent his life in pursuit of truth and virtue, was now on trial for his very life. He would have to defend himself in front of a jury of 501 of his fellow Athenian citizens. This wasn't a trial with a professional judge and lawyers as we might imagine it today. It was a public spectacle, a democratic showdown. The accusers would present their case, and then Socrates would have his chance to speak. The fate of the gadfly rested in the hands of the very horse he had spent his life trying to awaken. The tension was palpable. This was to be more than a trial of one man, but a trial of ideas. When it was his turn to speak, Socrates did not behave like a typical defendant. He didn't beg for mercy or flatter the jury. He didn't bring his weeping wife and children to court to elicit sympathy, a common tactic at the time. Instead, he did what he had always done. He questioned, he reasoned, and he spoke with a defiant, almost arrogant honesty. He began by systematically dismantling the charges against him. On the charge of impiety, he pointed out the absurdity of it. How could he introduce new gods while also being an atheist? The accusations, he argued, were contradictory and nonsensical, born of old prejudice and slander against him. He then addressed the more serious charge of corrupting the youth. He challenged his main accuser, Meletus, directly, engaging him in a classic Socratic dialogue right there in the courtroom. He asked Meletus who exactly improves the youth of Athens. Meletus, after some fumbling, suggested it was the laws, the jurors, the council, essentially everyone Socrates. Socrates brilliantly turned this around, using an analogy with horses. He asked if everyone knows how to train a horse, or if it is just one expert trainer. Meletus had to concede it was the expert. So Socrates concluded, isn't it more likely that only a few people know how to improve the youth, and that it's highly improbable that he alone is the one corrupting them all? Instead of apologizing for his life's work, Socrates doubled down on it. He proudly proclaimed that his philosophical mission was a service to the city, a gift from the gods. He was not a corrupter, but a benefactor. He explained his role as the gadfly, waking the city from its intellectual slumber. He told the jury that if they were to execute him, they would be harming themselves more than they would be harming him. They would be silencing the one voice that pushed them towards virtue and self-examination. He famously suggested that, far from being punished, he should be rewarded for his services with free meals at the Prytaneum, an honor reserved for Olympic champions and heroes of the state. This bold, perhaps even foolhardy defense did not sit well with the jury. They were expecting remorse, not a lecture. They wanted humility, not a demand for a hero's reward. Socrates was essentially telling them that they were the ones on trial, not him. He was challenging their wisdom, their authority, and their very way of life, right to their faces. He was forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth, that they were about to condemn a man not for any crime he had committed, but because his relentless questioning made them feel insecure and uncomfortable. His defense was a masterpiece of logic and integrity, but it was a disaster in terms of public relations. The verdict came, and it was close but not in his favor. Socrates was found guilty. Under Athenian law, the trial then moved to a second-phase sentencing. Both the prosecution and the defense could propose a penalty, and the jury would vote on which one to implement. The prosecution, unsurprisingly, called for the death penalty. Now was Socrates' chance to save himself. His friends urged him to propose a reasonable alternative, like exile or a hefty fine, which they offered to pay for him. The jury would almost certainly have accepted it. It would have been the easy way out, allowing him to live out his remaining years elsewhere. But Socrates, being Socrates, refused to compromise his principles. He argued that he had done no wrong, so why should he propose a punishment for himself? To propose exile would be to admit that he could not live peacefully elsewhere, as he would surely continue his questioning wherever he went. To propose a fine would be to admit his work had a monetary value, which it did not. After his earlier joke about free meals, he reluctantly suggested a token fine, but the damage was done. His defiance was seen as the ultimate insult. The jury, now more angered than before, voted for the death penalty by an even larger margin. Socrates was sentenced to die by drinking a cup of poisoned hemlock. In his final speech to the court, Socrates was remarkably calm and accepting. He told those who had voted to acquit him not to despair. He mused on the nature of death, suggesting it was either a dreamless sleep or a journey to another place where he could continue his questioning with the great heroes and thinkers of the past. For him, a true philosopher did not fear death. What he feared was a life lived without virtue and integrity. By choosing death over silence or exile, Socrates made his final and most powerful statement. He showed that his commitment to his principles and to the pursuit of truth was more important to him than life itself. The story of Socrates' trial echoes through the ages as a powerful lesson. It is a stark reminder of the danger that arises when a society becomes intolerant of criticism and dissenting voices. It teaches us about the courage it takes to stand up for one's beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming opposition and personal cost. Socrates chose not to escape his fate, transforming his execution into a form of martyrdom for philosophy. He demonstrated that true wisdom lies not in having all the answers, but in having the courage to ask the questions and to live and die by the results of that inquiry. His life was his argument, and his death was its unforgettable conclusion.